In the grey waters off the coast of Brittany in northwestern France, there was an area that local fishermen avoided at all costs. Known as the Bay of Lamentations, it was surrounded by rugged cliffs and shrouded in almost constant fog, even on the clearest of days. Stories told in seaside taverns claimed that there, beneath the choppy waves, lay the remains of dozens of shipwrecks over the centuries. But what really scared the seamen was not the wreckage itself, but the creature that supposedly guarded it. The guardian of the shipwreck, as he was known, was an ancient entity, described as a humanoid figure covered in algae, with long, disproportionate arms and luminescent eyes that pierced the mists. He was the shadow that moved among the wreckage. Many swore they heard his voice, a deep, anguished whisper that seemed to carry the pleas of souls lost at the bottom of the sea. And before we continue with this intriguing story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us bring more content like this to you. Now, let's get back to the story. This was a story that Henri Moreau, a lone diver, had known since he was a child. He grew up listening to the warnings of his grandmother, an austere woman who firmly believed in the guardian. "Don't go near the Bay of Lamentations, boy. It doesn't matter what they say. The guardian is not a myth," she whispered, with a stern look while tying up worn fishing nets. "He's there, and those who try to steal what the ocean took never return." Henri always considered these stories to be the exaggerations of a superstitious old woman. Now 34 years old, he was a cynical and practical man. The hard life had hardened him, and he specialized in exploring submerged wrecks to recover valuable artifacts. With his small boat, the Albatross, and modern diving equipment, Henri sailed alone, looking for forgotten ships. He knew that the Weeping Bay wreck was off limits, but he also knew that if anyone was brave or foolish enough to try, the rewards would be immeasurable. He had heard rumors of valuable treasures hidden in a 17th century Spanish ship, the San Telmo, that supposedly rested in those treacherous waters. One afternoon, while preparing his maps and equipment in a small port nearby, he was approached by a mysterious man, dressed in a sodden overcoat and with eyes that seemed older than himself. "Are you Henri Moreau, the diver?" asked the stranger, his voice rough like the sound of wind in the masts of a ship. "It depends on who is asking," replied Henri suspiciously. The man leaned over, revealing an old, worn map. "This is the location of San Telmo. They say that the riches he carries would make a man never need to work again in his life. But you know the story, don't you?" Henri looked at the map and felt his heart quicken. He recognized that name. His grandmother had mentioned San Telmo countless times. "I know the stories, but I also know that they are nothing more than stories. You want me to get it back, don't you?" The man nodded slowly, but there was something in his gaze that made Henri hesitate. "Just be careful," murmured the stranger. "There are things in the depths that should not be disturbed." The next morning, Henri left. The sea was calm, but as he approached the bay, the fog thickened, as if the ocean itself wanted to hide him from intruders. He anchored the Albatross in shallow water and began donning his diving gear. Even as he checked his oxygen cylinder and tested his underwater flashlight, he felt like he was being watched. Descending through the murky waters, Henri soon saw the first signs of the wreckage, pieces of wood encrusted with coral, rusty cannons, and open, empty safes. So far, only legends, he thought. But then he saw something that made his blood run cold. At the bottom of the sea, partially covered by sand and algae, was a humanoid figure. It was too big to be a normal human being, with long, disproportionate limbs. Seaweed seemed to grow directly from its body, and its eyes glowed like green torches in the dark. The Guardian. Henri restrained himself from dropping his flashlight. He knew he needed to be careful. If the stories were true, that creature did not tolerate marauders. But something in the gleam in the Guardian's eyes seemed to challenge him. It was as if he were saying, "Dare." He looked away, trying to ignore the discomfort, and swam deeper into the wreckage. There he found something unexpected, an intact chest sealed with chains. It was a rare sight, as the wreckage was typically looted for decades. As Henri examined the chest, he felt a vibration at the bottom of the ocean. A cold and dense current swept past him, making him look around. The Guardian was now closer, moving slowly but deliberately. He didn't swim. It was as if he floated, dragged by the ocean's own will. Suddenly, a muffled sound echoed across the water, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. Henri realized that it was no ordinary sound. It was a voice. "Leave what belongs to the ocean, or join us." Henri hesitated. He had never believed in legends, but that presence was undeniable. Should he defy the Guardian and open the chest, or would it be better to retreat before it was too late? As the whisper grew, something inside Henri, a mix of ambition and fear, led him to a decision that would change his life forever. Henri's hesitation lasted only an instant. The promise of riches and the chance to discover something few would dare explore prevailed over growing fear. He grabbed the chains that sealed the chest and, with effort, began to unwind them. The sound of metal scraping against the sea floor seemed amplified, echoing like a scream across the aquatic expanse. The vibration that had previously been subtle now intensified, pulsing like a living heart. Henri felt the pressure of the water around him increase, as if the ocean was holding its breath, awaiting his next action. "Leave it!" The whisper turned into a muffled roar, reverberating through his diving mask. He froze for a moment, his fingers hovering over the rusty padlock that kept the trunk sealed. Turning slowly, he saw that the Guardian had come even closer. The creature hovered just a few meters away from him, its body wrapped in streams of seaweed that moved like living snakes. The bright eyes burned with an almost hypnotic intensity, and Henri realized he wasn't just being watched, he was being evaluated. "It can't be real," he muttered to himself, but deep down he knew he was facing something far beyond his understanding. Deciding to ignore the warning, Henri pulled out a crowbar attached to his diving belt and forced the lock on the trunk. With a clicking sound, the padlock broke and the lid opened. A cloud of sediment spread across the water, obscuring his vision for a few seconds. When the dust settled, he saw the contents: Spanish gold coins, gem-encrusted jewelry, and an ornate cross that seemed to radiate a ghostly glow. "It's real," he whispered, his heart racing. He began filling a small canvas bag with the most valuable items, but with each piece removed, the water around him seemed to grow thicker, heavier. The Guardian didn't move, but Henri felt its presence growing, as if the creature itself was absorbing the ocean's rage. Suddenly, a gigantic shadow passed above him. Henri looked up and saw the outlines of something huge, like the remains of a mast swaying slowly in the current. But what stopped him was the sound, a chorus of voices whispering in unison, faint but unmistakable. Come back, go away, before it's too late." The whispers seemed to be coming from everywhere, growing in intensity and reverberating inside his mind. He tried to ignore them and went back to the trunk, but he noticed that his movements were slower, as if something invisible was binding his limbs. He looked down and saw thin, almost translucent seaweed wrapping around his legs. Henri began to pull at them, but the more he struggled, the more the seaweed seemed to tighten like living tentacles. His breathing became ragged, the sound of compressed oxygen echoing in his ears. He needed to escape. With effort, he cut through the algae with a diving knife and began to swim toward the surface, holding the canvas bag tightly. But the creature wouldn't let him go so easily. The Guardian finally moved, gliding through the water with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. Before Henri could react, the Guardian was in front of him, blocking his path upwards. "What the ocean takes cannot be returned." The Guardian's voice was deep and echoed inside Henri's head, as if it came directly from his subconscious. Desperate, Henri pulled out the knife and pointed it at the Guardian. But the creature didn't seem threatened. Instead, she raised one of her long arms and pointed at the canvas bag Henri was holding. "Do you want this and that?" Henri shouted, although his voice barely came through the mask. He opened the bag, held out some gold coins, and dropped them into the water. "Ready! Take it back!" The coins slowly floated to the bottom, but the Guardian didn't move. It was as if the creature was waiting for something more. Henri understood what the Guardian wanted. It wasn't the gold or jewelry. It was him. Before he could think of another solution, he felt a violent tug on his ankle. Something invisible was pulling him down towards the open chest, which now seemed to emanate a faint, pulsating light. He kicked and struggled, but the force was irresistible. As he sank, his eyes met the Guardian's again. They were closer now, and Henri saw something unexpected: sadness. The voices around him intensified, and he realized something terrible. They were supplications. They were human voices. The souls of the people who had tried to loot the wreckage before him were there, trapped forever in the Guardian's realm. With one last effort, Henri managed to free the canvas bag and shouted, "I'll give it back! It's all here!" The voices stopped. The Guardian moved away slowly, but not enough to open a clear path to the surface. Henri had no more time. His lungs were burning, and his oxygen tank was starting to run low. He knew he needed to act quickly, or he would be another soul lost at the bottom of the bay. The question now was not just survival, it was understanding what the Guardian wanted from him and figuring out how to escape that watery nightmare. The weight of the silence at the bottom of the ocean was almost unbearable. Henri hovered in the watery darkness, panting as the pressure of the water around him seemed to intensify by the second. His eyes were fixed on the Guardian's, who was watching him with an uneasy calm, as if awaiting his next decision. The coins he had dropped floated around the chest, but something in the environment indicated that it wasn't enough. The creature didn't attack, but it also didn't allow him to climb. It was as if the Guardian was imposing a judgment. "What do you want?" Henri shouted, even though he knew his voice wouldn't make it past the diving mask. Suddenly, the surrounding water began to glow with a dull, bluish light. Henri looked around and saw vague shapes beginning to materialize. Translucent humanoid figures emerged from nowhere, moving slowly as if in a trance state. Their faces, deformed and empty, conveyed despair. "The lost." The Guardian's voice echoed in Henri's mind, clear and solemn. "They challenged the balance." Like you, Henri realized that those figures were the souls of the previous victims: fishermen, explorers, marauders, all those who had dared to challenge the Guardian's rule. Their bodies were unrecognizable, but their eyes conveyed pain. The voices of the souls began to rise again, blending into a deafening chorus of pleas. "Freedom, help, we don't want to stay here anymore." Henri felt a chill run down his spine. He now understood that he was being tested, but he did not know how to escape that fate. The seaweed currents began to ripple around him again, once again wrapping around his legs, this time with even greater force. He struggled, pulling out his knife to try and cut the seaweed, but it seemed tougher now, as if it was reacting to his attempt to escape. The Guardian remained motionless, but his eyes glowed with increasing intensity. "Do you want the exit?" asked the Guardian, his voice ringing with a warning tone. "Prove that you are worthy of leaving." Henri, desperate, shook his head. "How? Tell me what to do." The creature extended one of its disproportionate hands and pointed to the chest, which was still open. But this time, Henri noticed something he hadn't noticed before. At the bottom of the chest, hidden among the jewelry and coins, was a small figure carved from a material that looked like black stone. It was intricate and detailed, depicting a creature similar to the Guardian, but with empty eyes and an angry expression. Henri hesitantly swam to the chest, pulling the figure from inside. As soon as he touched it, a tremor ran through the water around him, and the voices stopped instantly. The Guardian tilted his head slightly, as if waiting for Henri to understand the meaning of the object. "And that? Is this what you want?" he asked, holding the figure in his hand. The Guardian didn't respond, but the seaweed around Henri began to slowly loosen, as if giving him space to act. He looked at the figure again and noticed something disturbing. The eyes carved into the stone were starting to glow, emitting a faint red light. A primitive instinct inside Henri warned him that this was no ordinary artifact. It was something older, something that carried a dark power. He felt the pressure of the impending choice. Something inside him told him that if he returned the figure to the trunk and left everything as it was, maybe the Guardian would let him go. But there was another, more dangerous thought in his mind. What if he took the artifact with him? He knew that the object could be worth an unimaginable fortune to collectors or museums. The Guardian stepped forward, eyes now fixed on the artifact in Henri's hand. The tension in the atmosphere was palpable, as if the entire ocean was awaiting his decision. "If I leave this here, will you let me go?" Henri asked, his voice trembling. The answer came in the form of a deep vibration, which seemed like an implicit yes. But he also knew that this decision meant giving up the reason he had dived there in the first place. Henri's heart hammered in his chest. He knew that his survival depended on that choice, but greed and the desire for recognition fought against his reason. He looked back at the Guardian, whose eyes were shining more brightly by the second. "No," muttered Henri, with a conviction he himself didn't know he had. He gripped the artifact tighter and began to swim upwards, ignoring the Guardian's roars and the pleas of the surrounding souls. The moment he started to rise, the surrounding seaweed exploded into motion. They gripped him tighter than before, while the figures of lost souls surrounded him, trying to hold him back. He fought against them, cutting and kicking desperately. But then something unexpected happened. The Guardian let out a low cry, almost like a wail, and all the water around him began to move in a violent current. Henri was thrown to the side, losing his figure for an instant. He tried to reach for it, but before he could reach for it again, the Guardian approached and grabbed it with his long hands. The artifact disappeared in the Guardian's hand, and he looked at Henri one last time, before diving deep into the shadows of the ocean, taking with him the object's red glow. Henri noticed that the algae were loosening and that the voices had disappeared. He swam upward with all his might, his oxygen tank nearly empty. When he finally broke the surface, the cold, biting air of the Bay of Lamentations greeted him. He crawled onto the deck of the Albatross, coughing and shaking. But his mind was fixed on what had happened. He had escaped, but something inside him told him he wasn't truly free. The apparent calm of the Bay of Lamentation was almost scarier than the underwater confrontation itself. Henri was stretched out on the deck of the Albatross, panting and exhausted. Each breath seemed to carry the weight of the water that almost swallowed him, and his heart pounded at a frantic pace. The silence around was unsettling, broken only by the gentle sound of waves lapping against the hull of the boat. Although he survived, he knew something was wrong. Ever since the Guardian disappeared into the depths with the artifact, Henri felt that something had followed him. He couldn't explain it. It was a feeling that he was no longer alone, as if something invisible had clung to him during his escape. Henri stood up, shaking, and checked his equipment. The canvas bag of coins and jewelry was still there, but the weight of the gold in his hands felt more like a burden than a prize. He wondered if he should just throw it back into the sea. "No, that's crazy," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "I almost died from that. I can't go back empty-handed." He adjusted the Albatross's sails and began sailing back to the small home port. As he maneuvered the boat, something caught his attention. A thicker, more opaque layer of fog began to form around the boat, much denser than before. The sea, which had previously been relatively calm, began to stir slightly, as if a whirlpool was forming somewhere in the distance. The boat's radio, which he rarely used, began to emit a low hiss. Henri looked at the device strangely. The hissing became more acute, and then he heard something that chilled him. Come back to us." He turned off the radio immediately, his hand shaking. "I'm going crazy. This is exhaustion. I just need to get to the port," he told himself, trying to ignore the growing sense of panic. After hours of sailing, Henri finally saw the coastline, but the relief he should have felt didn't come. The fog had followed him here, wrapping the boat like a suffocating cloak. When he finally reached the port, the place looked different. Normally bustling with fishermen and locals going about their business, it was now empty. He docked the albatross, hurriedly got out, and tied up the boat with shaking hands. The silence was disconcerting. The fish stalls were abandoned, fishing nets hung like forgotten specters, and there was no sign of human life. "Where the hell is everyone?" he asked himself, looking around. As he walked through the narrow streets leading to the village, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He quickly turned around, but there was no one. The feeling of being followed became more intense, and Henri began to walk faster, his heart racing. Finally, he arrived at the inn where he was staying. It was an old stone building, with small windows and heavy curtains. He entered and locked the door behind him, leaning against it as he took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "I just need to rest. Tomorrow everything will seem less surreal," he said out loud, as if he wanted to convince himself of that. Climbing the wooden stairs that creaked beneath his feet, he entered the simple room where he had left his belongings. He placed the canvas bag with the gold on the bed and stared at it, his mind spinning with conflicting thoughts. But as he considered what he should do, he heard that sound again. The muffled whisper, familiar and impossible to ignore. "You brought this here." The voice seemed to come from inside the room. He looked around frantically, but he was alone. "They shouldn't be here. You condemned them." Henri backed up until he hit the wall, his breathing heavy. "Who's there? What do you want from me?" he shouted, but the whispering stopped. Suddenly, the light from the lamp flickered and went out completely. The room was plunged into total darkness, and Henri felt an icy cold envelop the room. As his eyes adjusted to the lack of light, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Streaks of seaweed were beginning to form on the walls, oozing as if they had just emerged from the sea. In the center of the room, a figure began to emerge. At first, it seemed like an indistinct shape, but then it became clearer. It was one of the lost souls he had seen at the bottom of the ocean. Her eyes were empty, but she moved slowly toward him, one hand outstretched as if begging, "Help us. Free us." Henri screamed and ran out of the room, tripping on the steps as he went downstairs. But the figure was not left behind. She followed him, floating silently as he struggled to find his way out. When he finally opened the inn's door and ran outside, he found the entire village immersed in fog, but it was no longer empty. Humanoid shapes slowly wandered the streets, the same souls he had seen in the shipwreck. Their whispers echoed like a macabre choir, filling the air with pleas for help. "You brought us here. Give back what is ours. Give it back." Henri knew what they wanted. The canvas bag was still in the room, but something told him that returning the coins wouldn't be enough. He needed to return to the Bay of Wailing, needed to confront the Guardian again. The problem was that he didn't know if the Guardian would receive him alive this time. The journey back to the Bay of Lamentations began under heavy, threatening skies. Henri had spent the night awake, tormented by incessant visions and whispers. Every corner of the village seemed inhabited by echoes of lost souls, and the empty eyes of the figures wandering in the fog were etched in his mind. He knew he had no choice. The only way to end this was to return the treasures and face the Guardian again. With the albatross fueled and the canvas bag containing the coins and jewels back on board, he set off at dawn. The sea was rough, as if the ocean reflected Henri's restlessness. The biting wind and splashing cold water did nothing to ease the tension in his shoulders. "That's all, I give everything back, and that ends," he repeated to himself like a desperate prayer. However, deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Something about the look of the lost souls and the Guardian's resigned silence as he fled made him uneasy. It wasn't just about the gold or the jewelry. That's what they represented. Disrespect for what the ocean had taken. As he approached the bay, the fog began to swallow him again. Visibility dropped drastically, and the world around him seemed to shrink to just him, the boat, and the raging waves. The sound of the sea seemed different, like a constant whisper mixed with distant screams. When he finally reached the wreck site, Henri felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The waters there were restless, but there were no visible waves. It was as if the entire ocean was pulsing with rage. He donned his diving gear with shaking hands, adjusting the oxygen cylinder and attaching the canvas bag to his belt. Before diving, he looked at the horizon one last time, hoping to see something that would indicate that he still had a chance of getting out of there alive. But all he saw was fog. "Let's get this over with," he whispered to himself, diving into the cold water. The descent was rapid, and soon Henri found himself once again in the Guardian's sunken kingdom. The wreckage of the ships appeared in front of him, covered in coral and algae, just as he remembered. But now the atmosphere seemed even darker. The shadows among the wreckage seemed more alive, more attentive. Then he felt it. The vibration at the bottom of the ocean, like a heart that beat in a slow and ominous rhythm. The Guardian was there, waiting. Henri swam towards the chest where he had found the artifact. He knew that was where he needed to leave the items. But as he got closer, he saw something that made him stop. The chest was no longer in the same place. Instead, he was suspended, floating lightly, as if the ocean had lifted him up in reverence. And next to the chest was the Guardian. The creature seemed larger than before, its presence more imposing. The green eyes shone with intensity, fixed on Henri. He stopped a few meters away with the canvas bag in his hands. "I brought it back. All," said Henri, his voice muffled by the diving mask. The Guardian didn't move, but the whispers around him grew louder. What was taken must be returned. Henri opened the bag and began to release the coins and jewelry one by one, letting them float towards the chest. Each piece he released seemed to ease the pressure in the room a little, but the whispers still didn't stop. When the bag was empty, he looked at the Guardian, waiting for some sign that it was enough. But the creature only tilted its head, as if sizing him up again. "That's all. I returned it," Henri shouted, feeling his despair growing. Suddenly the Guardian raised one of its long arms and pointed at Henri. A whirlpool began to form around him, pulling him towards the chest. He tried to swim against the current, but it was useless. Within seconds, he was being dragged to the bottom, directly into the chest, which now glowed with a pulsating blue light. When Henri touched the chest, he felt an overwhelming force envelope him. Images began to flood his mind, scenes of shipwrecks, men fighting for their lives, women and children being swallowed up by the waves. He saw the San Telmo sink, its crew begging for mercy. And then he saw the Guardian, rising from the depths to claim the wreckage as part of his kingdom. "You upset the balance. Now you must decide." The Guardian's voice resounded in his mind. In front of Henri, the chest opened again. Inside, besides the coins and jewelry, was the carved figure he had touched before. He knew that was the key to everything, but he also knew that touching it again would mean something terrible. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his words full of despair. "Sacrifice," replied the Guardian. Henri realized what was being asked. To restore balance, he would need to leave something valuable behind, something more than gold or jewelry. He would need to leave part of himself behind. He reached out to the sculpted figure, feeling the weight of his decision. Henri held the sculpted figure between his fingers, feeling an energy pulse through it, something that seemed alive and at the same time impossible to understand. The Guardian did not move, but the whispers around it grew louder, as if the souls from the depths were anxiously awaiting the next moment. The water seemed to vibrate with an almost unbearable tension. Sacrifice something, or join us. The phrase echoed repeatedly in his mind, more and more intense, as if the choice were inevitable. Henri knew there was no longer any escape, but what exactly should he offer? He looked around, his eyes fixed on the wreckage that surrounded him, on the objects he had pulled out of the bay, and for a moment he thought, what if he wanted my life? No, Henri murmured, his breathing quickened, his heart racing. I'm not going to die here, I can't. But even as he said this, he felt the weight of reality. Nothing he had experienced made sense, except the Guardian's cruel logic. The ocean always took, and everything he had tried to recover was now taking its toll. He tried to swim back, away from the chest, away from the Guardian, but the invisible currents around him didn't allow it. It was as if the ocean was holding his body, forcing him to face that choice. "What do you want from me?" he shouted again, this time with a mixture of anger and despair. The Guardian raised one of its long arms again and pointed at Henri. The blue light emanating from the chest became stronger, illuminating the entire underwater area. Then a vision began to form before him. Henri saw himself, but not as he was now. He was on dry land, walking through the village streets, carrying the bag of gold. People looked at him with admiration, some with envy, but what surprised him was the expression on his face. It wasn't joy or pride, it was empty. The vision changed, and now he was alone, surrounded by the same fog he had found in the village. But this time, he felt souls from the depths around him. They didn't let him go completely. Even on dry land, he was trapped. If you take what is ours, you will be doomed, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. Henri began to understand. The Guardian didn't just want gold or treasures, he wanted balance. What had been taken from the sea had to be replaced with something of equal value, and if he did not accept this, he would be haunted forever. He looked at the figure in his hand. She seemed to vibrate, almost as if she was alive, and Henri knew that little statue carried the essence of the Guardian and his dominion. Touching her again had linked her life to the ocean, and now he would need to make a choice. "Do you want this?" he asked, holding the figure more strongly. But the Guardian only watched, immovable, while the surrounding whispers grew in a desperate choir. "Choose, choose, choose." Henri closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He knew what he needed to do. "All good. I return. I return everything." He held the figure and put it back into the chest, pushing it to the bottom with the coins and jewelry that had recovered. The moment his hands released the object, the water around him was calm. The algae that had moved frantically stopped, and the Guardian retreated a little, as if accepting his offer. But then Henri realized something. Despite returning everything, the Guardian didn't let him go. He felt the currents around intensify again, pulling him toward the chest. "No, I returned. I did what you asked for." The Guardian tilted his head slightly, and for the first time Henri heard something more in his voice. "It is still missing." Before he could react, the invisible currents pulled him hard, and he was thrown against the chest. His hands clung to the edges, trying to resist, but the power of the ocean was relentless. Henri realized that it was not just the gold or the figure he needed to return. It was something deeper. It was him. "Please, no, I didn't want to. I just wanted to survive," he begged while the chest was beginning to shine with a more intense light. The last things he saw were the Guardian's eyes. There was no hatred on them, but a deep sadness, almost as if the creature was also attached to the same destination. Then the chest lid closed, and the darkness swallowed him. Hours later, Albatross was found to drift through local fishermen. They climbed on board, but found no one, just a bag of empty canvas and a trail of algae scattered throughout the deck. At the bottom of the Bay of the Laments, the Guardian remained motionless by the chest, his fixed gaze in the wreckage around. And between the shadows, a new figure could be seen, wandering silently, with empty eyes and a sad countenance. Henri had become another lost soul, arrested forever in the Guardian's submerged domain. Brittany fishermen continued to avoid the Bay of the Laments, but now the stories told in the taverns took an even darker tone. Many claimed to have seen something different in the treacherous waters, not just the bright eyes of the Guardian, but a new presence. "There is something new there," said Henri, an old sailor with decades of experience. "A shadow that wasn't before. Somebody." On dense fog nights, residents of the nearby villages began reporting voices in the distance, loaded by the wind. They were whispers that echoed as an endless lament, always coming from the direction of the bay. One morning, a young fisherman named Alain found an unusual piece stuck in his nets. It was a Spanish gold coin embedded with corals, with a slight blue light emanating from it. Alain took her to the village, showing her to other fishermen who, instead of being excited, retreated with fear. "Throw it into the sea, Alain!" shouted one of them, his eyes wide. "You don't know what you are bringing here." But Alain, moved by greed, ignored the warnings. That night, while sleeping on her hut by the sea, woke up with a strange feeling. The air was heavy and the moisture seemed suffocating. Then he heard, "You disturbed what shouldn't." When looking out the window, he saw a figure standing in the sand of the beach, illuminated only by the pale light of the moon. He was a man, or at least it seemed to be. His body was covered with algae, and his empty eyes shone with a spectral blue. Alain tried to scream, but his voice failed. The figure stepped toward the sea and then disappeared. The next day, Alain's cabin was empty. His boat was found to drift in the bay with no sign of its occupant. Over time, Henri Moreau's name was forgotten, as well as rumors about his disappearance. However, those who approached the Bay of Laments still saw the lost souls wandering in the depths. The Guardian was still in his post, relentless and silent, but now there was another. Henri was there, like a spectrum condemned to protect the wreckage he once tried to loot. And at night, when the wind blew hard and the fishermen housed in their homes, a new legend was beginning to be whispered. If you hear the laments in the wind, it's Henri Moreau. He is there, stuck between the living and the dead, ensuring that no one makes the same mistake. The Bay of Lament remained untouched, and the cycle continued. What did you think of this outcome? Leave your opinion in the comments. We love to know what you think, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support our work. See you in the next video.